So good afternoon, folks. Now, on behalf of the faculty and staff of the Center for Latin American Studies and the Center for Brazilian Studies, I welcome you to the first webinar in our Race, Racism, and Resilience in Latin America speaker series. Before introducing our speaker, I'd like to take a moment to highlight the intention of our speaker series. We're in a global moment of complete disruption, caused not only by the COVID-19 virus that has taken more than 1 million lives and infected more than 36 million people, but also by harsh swings in governments toward neoliberal and conservative policies that further social injustices, along with a deteriorated global economy that will take years to stabilize. These issues impact all of us, but impact our most vulnerable populations more profoundly than the general population because of structural inequalities steeped in racial discrimination that has gone unchecked and unaddressed for far too long. And while these are global issues, we need to understand them as expressed within particular cultural frames and histories. In this lecture series, we bring together scholars and activists on and from Latin America to discuss the ways in which racism is experienced and contested in this region. Their discussions focus on the intersections of colonialism, Blackness, indigeneity, violence, and the social movements in Afro-descendant and indigenous communities. This fall, we begin with Mexico, and will bring you discussions from Colombia and Brazil on the Black and Afro-Latinidad experiences in a collective effort to trace transnational connections of struggle and resilience beyond political and cultural borders. In the spring, look for conversations with our indigenous communities, los pueblos originarios, as they share their particular struggles and their successes with us. Before jumping in, I want to make sure that everybody is comfortable in this format. You're in the Zoom webinar, and many of you may not have experienced the Zoom webinar format. You can't see each other. You can only see Dr. Jerry and I at this moment, but you can use the chat to talk to each other as well as to Crystal Bivona. Crystal is our tech wizard on all of this, so if you're experiencing any problems, feel free to go into the chat and let her know. You'll also see a section, Q&A. If you have any questions as we're going through our brief interview, feel free to put them up, and then once Dr. Jerry and I have had a chance to talk a little bit, we'll start taking questions, and Dr. Jerry will be more than happy to answer any questions that you have. So today, we are gifted with a conversation on the production of the Black subject in Mexico with Dr. Anthony Jerry from the Department of Anthropology at the University of California in Riverside. Dr. Jerry is an alum of San Diego State University, having completed both his BA and his MA in anthropology here, and was the Associate Director for the Center for Latin American Studies for a number of years after completing his doctorate in anthropology at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. His dissertation, entitled Explorations of Blackness, Voices from Within the Diaspora, was very well received and continues to be an important dialogue. Since then, he has published a number of articles on Blackness in Mexico, and in particular among the communities in the Costa Chica region of Oaxaca, Mexico. He also has been featured in a number of popular resources, including the Los Angeles Sentinel, where he talked about love and rage in Black political and social movements, and in Muckrack in the San Diego Voice, where he talked about Black resistance. He is also the founder of the Cultural Media Archive here in San Diego that provides an outlet for the voices of youth. Welcome home, Dr. Jerry.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be back at San Diego State, if only in the virtual form, right?
Exactly, but we're glad to have you here.
Well, thank you.
So,
just one correction: the Explorations of Blackness, that was my thesis at San Diego State.
Oh, was it?
Right. You were on both of my committees, so yeah. So I just wanted to point that out.
What was your dissertation?
Chasing Blackness.
Chasing
almost
Blackness.
Similar to the manuscript, yeah. But it's sort of the thesis that you were on actually my thesis advisor actually sort of was a stepping stone to the dissertation, which is still sort of a piece of the project that we'll talk about today. So it's all related. Yeah.
So how many years have you really been exploring this particular topic from a scholarly perspective?
Well, I guess that depends on when sort of that scholarly journey begins, right? So I first became familiar with Black communities in Mexico in 2003 In 2003, I did a study abroad trip to Oaxaca. And so my first interest was immigration. I thought that I could go to Oaxaca and study immigration. And then we ended up going on a trip to the Costa Chica, and I realized that there were, I had, all of a sudden the scenery starts to change from sort of the urban to the rural, and then the different sort of, mountainous and then coastal regions. But along with the scenery, right, you have a change in sort of what people might perceive as ethnic geographies, right? And then all of a sudden at the coast, right, I expected indigeneity, of course, in the mountains, but then all of a sudden in the coast, I saw these folks that, seemed to me to look like people in my own family. And then I had to ask myself, right, coming from Southern California, right, and growing up in this moment of sort of surrounded by these narratives of Chicano resistance in Southern California and whatnot, I had to ask myself why I had never heard about, communities of Black folks in Mexico. And so for me, that sort of started then sort of this, that journey that you're talking about, right? Sort of thinking about how it is that we could conceive of and then articulate, right, or talk about Blackness in Mexico.
So one of the remarkable aspects of your research is your use of citizenship as the starting point for understanding how race is experienced in Mexico. Can you elaborate on this in terms of what this focus provides you when explaining the lived experience of the Black communities, such as say of the Costa Chica region in Oaxaca?
Sure. So remarkable, right? Some folks would suggest that citizenship perhaps is not the lens to talk about Black folks, but I think for me, the reason why citizenship I think is an important lens is because it allows us to get to a sort of relational aspect, right? When I first started doing research in Oaxaca and seriously as a master's student, this cultural movement, or if you'll call it a movement, that seems to be developing now in the Costa Chica around the idea of a cultural type of Blackness didn't exist, right? And talking to Black folks in Mexico, they weren't very concerned about the idea of the diaspora either. And so the paradigms, at least at that time that I had at my disposal, right, the ways of thinking about Blackness were either sort of these autochthonous, semi-indigenous communities, right, that had their own sort of cultural identities and understandings of themselves as different from the general national populations, right? The other paradigm then was diaspora, right, that these folks had recognized that they couldn't be a part of the nation state, and therefore they saw themselves through the lens of some sort of externality, right? They saw themselves as being outside of the nation, and Africa, or at least a broader Black diaspora, in the Americas and the Caribbean then became a frame for folks to talk about themselves. So these two things didn't seem to exist to me. And so I had to ask myself, not did they not exist to me, but people weren't talking about themselves and their own experiences within these contexts. And so I had to ask myself, then how is it that we talk about Blackness in Mexico, or the experience, the continued existence of Black folks in Mexico, in relation to other folks, right? So Black folks in Mexico were talking about themselves as Mexicans rather than as Black. And if you ask them, whether they were Black or not, they would sort of reluctantly agree that perhaps they had dark skin, but there didn't seem to be an identity around that. And so at the thesis stage, I just kind of went along with the research, right? I asked people about their racial or ethnic identities, and I got a lot of sort of runaround, and I just accepted that as part of the process. And then during the dissertation research phase, I went back, and at this moment, then the government had actually started to recognize their Black communities, right? Now the Black communities in Mexico had been, at least in Oaxaca, had been superficially recognized, sort of lip service in the state constitution at that time, sort of as communities that existed, but there hadn't been any official recognition of these communities and a recognition of their current presence or their past, or they hadn't yet become political subjects. And so then,
can I just ask you right there?
Sure.
So when you said they hadn't quite become political subjects, do you mean they hadn't quite become political subjects to the state, to themselves?
They hadn't yet started to talk about their Blackness in terms of a politics of difference. They hadn't started to talk about their own Blackness as a way to position them against other folks for political means, right? Now, if some folks will say that every relationship is political, right? You know Michael Kearney, and his sort of argument, is that if you go down to the very basic layers, every relationship is political, right? But what I mean to say is that Black folks hadn't necessarily figured out, or hadn't had the need yet to use their an identity of difference as a political tool to negotiate with the government.
And can I put this in context? Because we're talking
Sure.
about after the Zapatista uprising, we're talking about a time when indigenous communities are putting forward a very political statement about their status within the state, about who they were, and about the retention of their culture, of their language, of many of these things. So we're almost 10 years into that.
Right.
At the time,
at that moment in time, yeah.
This.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I think a little more than 10 years into that at the moment, and in fact, people in the community would talk about representatives from the Yucatan, the Zapatista sort of region, I guess, coming to the Costa Chica to talk about indigenous politics, right? And to talk about more of a broad sort of global indigeneity and that type of politics, but Blackness wasn't necessarily on the radar at that time. And so then the issue then of Black recognition then, and the way that I put it, and I know a lot of anthropologists might have trouble with this, but it was sort of a moment of invention, right? Because the Black subject and what it meant to be Black and how to talk about Blackness in a way that became a tool of association was at the moment of invention at that moment. And so I started to ask myself, if I couldn't use the paradigm of, cultural difference at the moment, if I couldn't use the paradigm of diaspora at the moment, then what sort of paradigm, right, could I use to think about Blackness in Mexico? And so I asked the question, well, what is it that Black recognition was really about? What was it for? Why recognize Black folks, right? And I started to think then that so many other identities, so many other social, I guess, relationships are tied up in Blackness, right? Then recognizing Blackness then in Mexico, or Black communities in Mexico, is not simply about recognizing Black folks, right? It's about recognizing Black folks in a way that doesn't unsettle or destabilize, right, all of the other subjects, right, that have been historically invented and then reproduced and put and kept in their place in Mexico, right? So it sort of dawned on me that the recognition of Black people in Mexico was really an issue of reproducing citizens and subjects in Mexico. And so it meant that the recognition of Blackness was necessarily intertwined with the recognition of mestizos, of indigenous folks, of folks that, people might call, blancos or whites in Mexico, right? And so then I started to ask myself, what role then does Blackness play in the process or the relationship that I see as citizenship, right? Not whether Black folks could become citizens or whether Black folks were citizens, right? Now that's a question I think that people have been asking for a long time. And I think people have, basically come to the idea or the argument that Black folks perhaps are not citizens. But I wanted to step back a little bit and not focus on the thing, the citizen, right? But ask how it is that these things then interact in a relationship that produces what we know as the Mexican.
So, but one of the things that you also have talked about is how, and you've hit on that a little bit, but how many of the community members, the Black community members, didn't see themselves as a Black subject, that they could point down the road and say, yeah, no, sure, they're Black in that community down there, but they didn't see themselves within this conversation that was emerging, because the whole conversation about recognizing Afro-Latinidad had really hit in many countries in South America, and it was kind of moving around throughout the region, right? Sure. So in your work, they could recognize that, from what I understand, having been on 2 committees. They recognize that, but they themselves had a hard time grasping that subject. Sure. I wonder if you could flesh that out a little.
Right. I don't think they had a hard time sort of grasping that subject, right? What they would do is they would sort of dodge it, right? Now, because Blackness at the time, or the idea of being Black in Mexico at the time,
And so we're still talking about the early 2000s?
I would say now too.
Okay.
I would say now. I would say even at present. So the idea of cultural Blackness sort of softens that a little bit, right? But the idea of racial Blackness associated with being descended from enslaved folks in Mexico at one particular moment in time, skin color and the issues of colorism and these kinds of things. I think still, at least in my experience and the folks that I work with, is still something that needs to be addressed. And I think the cultural issue is sort of sidestepping that, right? But we can get to that maybe. But I think the Black subject then, these folks recognized, right, that there was, right, a Black subject in Mexico, right? The question is these folks were reluctant to position themselves as a representation of that, right? So a lot of folks then have written about having this same experience. You go to the Costa Chica and you think, you come from somewhere else and you think, hey, you know what, all these folks are Black folks. And so now, since I recognize these folks as Black folks, all I have to do is ask them questions about their Blackness. And then I can get at what it means to be Black in Mexico. I can get at the experience of being Black in Mexico. And it turned out then that when you ask somebody, okay, hey, I'm here to talk to Black folks, they would say, oh, that's cool. And then they would say, well, you know what, if you really want to talk to Black folks, you're going to have to go down one more community. And then you would get to that community, and then they would say, hey, you're going to have to go down to another community, and so on and so on and so on. And then you'd find yourself at sort of the ends, right, of the Costa Chica, right? And in one instance, I found myself all the way down sort of to the ends of the state in Salina Cruz, right? Looking for, and Juchitán and these other places, looking for Black folks, right? And so what I realized then is that it's not that Black folks don't exist. It's not that the Black subject didn't exist in Mexico, right? It turned out that there was a situation where there was the Black subject, but no Black folks to actually fill it, right? Because they would all sort of try to move away from this notion of Blackness and then impose that subject on someone else, right? Now, I think a lot of folks then would say, okay, well, that means you're asking the wrong question. That means you brought your US understandings of what Black means to Mexico, and now you're imposing that. And what they're actually resisting, right, is the idea that that you're bringing down with you from the United States, right? Ideas of racism coming from the US and these kinds of things. And I said, okay, but what I didn't understand is how come none of them resisted the idea of a Black subject, right? How come they didn't say, oh, you know what, Black folks don't exist here, right? Rather, what they said is Black folks exist somewhere else. I'm not one of them. They didn't deny that there were Black folks in Mexico, that there were Black subjects, negros, right? And that the position of negro existed in Mexico. They just denied that it existed in their community, right? So then I started to ask myself, well, then what role might that subject play? Right? Not simply as a negation, right? Or people denying their Blackness, but what role might the existence of a Black subject play in Mexico for the production of other subject positions in Mexico, right? So the way that I like to think of that then is that the Black subject at that time existed as sort of a dark matter, right? And so astronomers, for example, right? They look into the sky and they see these things and they try to make sense of the way that things are moving, right, in relation to other things. And oftentimes what they have to do is they have to figure out how to talk about the interaction of something or the existence of something by talking about how it is that something else interacts with that something, because you can't see it, right? And so that's how they came up with this idea of dark matter. You can tell that dark matter is there, not by seeing it, but by understanding that other things have to interact with it, right? And by understanding how those other things interact with dark matter, then it tells you something about the dark matter. So I began to think then about the Black subject as a type of dark matter and ask myself then, what is it that dark matter does, right? So one of the ways then that I'm thinking about this is the Black subject then is used as sort of the foundation, the baseline, right, for producing other things that are supposedly non-Black, right? And it makes sense to me because whatever the Mexican nation is, right? I mean, we can have a debate about what it is, but I think people are clear about what it isn't, right? It's definitely not Black, right?
And that kind of goes to some of the conversations that you've had in your writing about the Black fetish, and
Right.
the Black fetish as kind of the production of separateness
Right.
from, and yet the foundation of the Mexican subject, of the Mexican, of mestizaje. Yeah, and you've talked in particular about how Blackness is or is not separate from the use of the indigenous subject in the creation of lo mexicano, of mestizaje. I'm wondering if you could talk about that a little bit, because I see it also in relation to this notion of Afro-Latinidad that has hit much of Latin America in creating these kind of pan movements.
Sure. I think what I would say then is sort of the fetishization of Blackness, I think, in Mexico, at least my understanding, right, is the approach to Blackness in Mexico as if it exists unto itself, right? And so for the longest time, there were folks doing research on Blackness in Mexico. In Mexico, if you read through, you know, different histories and people's writings throughout time, Blackness comes up, but it's always sort of the superficial, right? It's always sort of an add-on, right? The conversation is really about the mestizo, or it's really about indigenous folks and the use of indigeneity to produce the mestizo and those kinds of things. So then the question is, how do you then recognize Blackness in 2000 and whatever, right? In a way then that recognizes Blackness as part of this historical relationship in Mexico, rather than inventing the Black cultural subject out of thin air and saying, hey, there they are, right? Fully formed, right? That's dangerous, because what it does is it separates, right, Black communities from Mexico and sees them as sort of being a product unto themselves, right? Rather than actually a product of the exclusion of a particular group of people, rather than the product of the production of the nation of Mexico in the national moment, right? And the reproduction of Mexico later on at the revolutionary moment, right? And what it also does then is it tricks us into thinking that then these Black communities in isolation have retained sort of these cultural survivals, right? I think that people really don't take at least researchers and academics don't really take seriously anymore. But the idea of culture and you know, cultural entrepreneurs and the folks that are interested in sort of the consumption, right, of the other through culture, they really take those survivals seriously. So then you have people asking, well, you know, do they practice you know, some type of, you know, quote unquote voodoo, right? Trying to make this connection to places in Brazil or perhaps Cuba or those kind of places. They'll ask questions about other sort of Africanisms, right, that supposedly still survive. And those kinds of questions then allow us to sort of turn away from, right, the role that Blackness has historically played in Mexico in producing that, you know, personage, that thing that we call the Mexican, or the, you know, however it gets defined, right?
So in many ways, the Mexican state is in itself trying to create a Black identity in order to respond to this larger movement of Afro-Latinidad.
Absolutely, in a way to insulate itself from what I would call sort of the threat of Blackness, right? So ultimately then Black folks who decide, hey, we want to be recognized as Blackness or as Black, right? And then have this conversation about what that means, ultimately then threaten the narrative. They threaten the myth, right, of the Mexican nation. They threaten what it means to be Mexican. And so then some damage control has to be done, right? Because if to be Mexican is to not be Black, and then all of a sudden we say, hey, we have these communities of Black folks in Mexico that now want to officially, right, engage. They want to explicitly talk about themselves as Black communities, right? That then has to be managed in a way, like I said earlier, that doesn't sort of destabilize, right, the myth around what we perceive as Mexicanness, right?
So in Black communities, I'm imagining a couple of different things. One, and it's been part of my frustration, as you know, in much of my work, is the way in which the Mexican state commodifies various communities. So they've taken, you know, in the early 1990s, when I was first doing my research, they were commodifying indigenous populations, and in particular, women in indigenous populations in order to expand the tourist industry. So there are individual understandings within communities of language, of culture, of history, of being. But then the Mexican state had to create a larger narrative to fit them all into in order to have this kind of way of talking about the indigenous person, the indigeneity of mestizaje, right?
Sure.
So how is that unfolding for the Black communities? Because the Afro-Latinidad movement is pretty powerful in much of Latin America. And Mexico is not immune from tourism and from being commodified. You also have the Yucatan, which has another kind of Caribbean influence, and the Black populations in the Yucatan have a different relationship, I think, in some ways, to their histories and to their worlds than does the Pacific coast, which is what you're talking about.
Right, absolutely. And so that last piece that you say there, I think that's the reason why I choose citizenship over some of these other paradigms, right? In Veracruz, for example, you know, the Caribbean has been a trope, right? That's been used to talk about Blackness for a long time, right? So now it doesn't threaten the nation state. Actually, you can say, well, these Black folks are here because of our positioning as the sort of gateway to the Caribbean. And then all of a sudden you connect those folks to Cuba, and now we've done a great job of externalizing Blackness, and the nation state is now safe, right, from Blackness. You don't have that on the Pacific coast, right? You can't say they came from Cuba. You can't say it's the Caribbean and these other kinds of things. So the conversation then has to change. And Black folks then aren't immune, right, to that relationship that you're talking about, and the example that you gave about indigeneity, right? The way that I see that then is sort of a relationship of production and consumption, right? So what happens then is that the nation state, or let's just say Mexico, right, has found a way to produce images of indigeneity, right, that are consumable, right, that allow then non-quote unquote indigenous folks to be able to engage and claim, in a way, consume indigeneity, right, without having to be indigenous, right? So you can put on different types of clothes. You can sort of play at being indigenous. As you know, in Oaxaca, you can go down any street and consume, like literally physically consume indigeneity into your belly, right? And enjoy it for a little bit. And then it's gone. And then it doesn't have to stick with you, right? And so the nation state, I think, does that in similar ways, right? It uses indigeneity as a way to talk about itself, right? In the origin myth, right? But in a way that doesn't have to make it remain, right, indigenous. And I think what the government is doing now is they're trying to find a way to fit Black folks into that scheme, right? So they're talking about how is it that we talk about Black folks with specific culinary traditions, right? How do we talk about Blackness as part of this sort of authentic sort of fauna, right, for lack of a better word, in some of these communities in the coast that can attract tourism, right? The question, though, is who does that really sustain, right? Who's really sustained by that kind of work?
That's a huge issue in tourism in general, right? Anytime you start commodifying a group of people, please.
Right, absolutely. So then what's happening now is the Mexican government is trying to figure out a way then to incorporate Blackness into that relationship of production and consumption, right? And in a sort of simple way, I would see it as sort of Blackness being reimagined, right? Or placed once again as the means of production, right? So indigeneity for the longest time has been one of the foundational means of production for the Mexican nation, right? Indigeneity as an image, indigeneity as a form. Before that, right, if you go back to, you know, the moment before emancipation in Mexico, right, enslaved Black Africans, right, and their descendants were used as the means of production, right? The physical means of production. At the moment, the national moment, I would suggest then that Black folks were sort of pushed to the margins, and indigenous folks were actually seized upon as the ideological means of production for the nation state, or to produce this thing called Mexico. And so now that has become sort of the way, right? And so the Mexican government now is trying to figure out then how is it that we reincorporate Blackness, right, as one of the building blocks of Mexico, right? Not for the sake of Black communities, right?
Right.
But again, for the sake of the nation state, right?
Yeah. And in many ways, that is what you hear coming out of these kinds of official conversations on Afro-Latinidad in Mexico. But so let me ask you, so the Mexican state is attempting to create a narrative around Black communities in Mexico, and they're basing it within the larger conversations on Afro-Latinidad.
Sure.
Do you anticipate then that the Black communities become a Black subject and embrace the construction of a cultural essence that reflects this kind of Afro-Latinidad that becomes the identity constructed by the state? Or do you think there's an alternative way to forge an identity of Blackness that is separate from and builds on their actual lives, their actual histories, and their communities?
Right.
Is there that kind of moment of autonomy out there?
That's the question, right? That's the question. And I think the interesting thing is that I don't know that we can answer that question until that moment starts to happen. I wouldn't say no, that it's not possible, right? What I would say is that I think way back in 2010, right, or whatever it was, in 2011, the United Nations, declares 2011 the year of the African descendant, right? So Mexico jumps on board and they start, that's when they really sort of ramp up, right, to do this recognition of Black folks. And even in 2011, you could really kind of look into the future and predict, right, how Black recognition would have to take place, right? Now, if you would have left it up to Black folks in 2011, I think the idea of Blackness in Mexico as being something, describable in the terms that Black folks use in Mexico, such as negro, right, would have been a real possibility. But the negotiations that took place in 2011 around how it was that Black folks were going to be officially represented, right, in Mexico at the time, non-Black people shied away from the idea of negro because they didn't like the historical baggage that came along with it. They didn't like the racial connotation. They didn't like the idea of, they didn't like all of the nastiness that came with the term, right? And so they were almost sort of forced into this sort of identity, right, of Afro-Mexicano, right? And a lot of people push back. And I think folks now are embracing it in some ways, but I think a lot of those folks recognize, they recognize the process, I think, underneath, right? They recognize what's going on and why it is that the government and cultural promoters would prefer, right, Afro over Negro, right? And so there are a lot of folks that are still talking about themselves in terms of their I wouldn't even know how to translate it. I don't want to suggest that Negro translates into Blackness as it does in other places, but I would say it's similar, right? And so the question then, I guess, to answer your question, I think what will have to happen then is the government will have to be willing, right, to embrace that history. The government will have to be willing to participate, right, in a negotiation that takes two sides, that takes two parts, right? Black communities will have to be able to sit at the table with representatives from the government that are willing, right, to embrace, right, the historic role, not only, pre-national or pre-revolutionary, but historically, right, that Black folks have played in the nation, and the processes that have unfolded to produce Black communities as marginalized communities in Mexico today.
So some of the questions that are coming in, one is that I think might just kind of dovetail on this is our participant says, I thought in Mexico, race isn't accounted for because of the history of the caste system.
Right.
Is it now? Or how do Black Mexican groups get recognized as such politically?
I guess that question it would be, who do you ask, right? So race isn't accounted for according to who, right? According to the myth makers, according to those who have written down the narratives, according to historians and academics back in the day, right? And the folks responsible for creating the image, right, of the nation of Mexico. Racism didn't necessarily exist, right? But I wonder what that would mean, or what Black folks would say about that, right, in different moments, right? So,
like
for
if you
example,
could trace that conversation across the historic time period.
right, and I imagine that there's ways to do it, right? So, for example, people assume that Black folks or Black communities at the time participated in the war for independence, right? They participated in the war for independence specifically with the intention of being of having the right to sort of melt in, right, to the developing mestizo nation, or this idea of the new Mexican nation at the time, right? I think what that does is it assumes people's intentions after the fact, right? It takes the idea of mestizaje, it takes the idea of Mexico as a racial, what do they call that? It takes it. No. It takes the idea that Mexico has never had a problem with race, right? Mm-hmm. And then imposes that, right, on people's actions in the past, right? So what it does is it allows us to stand from the vantage of the present and then imagine that these folks actually made history in the way that we've read it, right, that we've seen it.
So we reinvent Blackness along the way. We reinvent.
Absolutely. Yeah. For our own purposes in the present. Right? And I think that's really what history seems to be about, right? We tell the story of the past, right? Not to make sure that we're telling the accurate story of the past, but to make sure that it's in line with our agenda or our goals of the present. Right?
I also hear a certain tension in that if Black communities point down the road, who's mm-hmm. going to write their history? Who's going to write what that experience is if there's not an embracing of the Black subject?
Right. So the interesting thing here is that there's a whole group of activists, right, that are embracing yes. and that have embraced for a long time that subject position, that positionality, that subjectivity, whatever we might call it. And those folks then are doing a lot of work in communities, right, to resist or to work against what people call auto-discrimination, right, sort of this self-hate, right, that they talk about in the context of people shifting, right, Blackness onto someone else. And so those folks are doing a lot of work. The other thing I think is it's important to recognize that depending upon who is asking, right, mm-hmm. Black folks have embraced and engaged with their, quote unquote Blackness for a long time. So what happens then is when I first show up, right, people don't recognize or don't understand exactly what my agenda is, right? And so the question they ask themselves is, do I want to be positioned by this person, right, in a way that could be perceived as negative for whatever means, because or for whatever end, I'm sorry, because they don't know, right, what my intentions are. And then once we started talking to each other, right, then, or they got more comfortable, they would refer to each other, they would refer to me, they would refer to people down the road as negro, right? They would refer to their communities as negro, right, as comunidades or pueblos negros, right, in the sense of being communities of Black folks who were interrelated, right? Cousins and aunts and uncles lived down the road. And that's the interesting thing too, right? Is these towns that these people would point me to, right, were towns where their uncle lived or where their cousins lived, right? Yeah. There's these familial connections, right? But if you were someone who they perceived as a threat, say an anthropologist, a non-Black anthropologist, right? Or an anthropologist who was associated with some other project, then again, they would say, oh no, there's no Black people here, right? So it was these shifting sort of, moving in and out, right, of this subject position.
It's a refusal to be called out according to a paradigm that you own as the person coming in versus the way in which they understand the self.
Right, and really trying to have some control. And this is a major issue, I think, with the Project for Black Recognition today, is Black folks are really trying to have some control over the way in which they're represented.
Yes.
Right? So Black folks don't really have access to the means of representation. Right? So how is it then that you can talk about yourself in a way that the broader national community, right, can translate, right? How can you become legible, right? And in a way that the broader national community could recognize how it is that you're representing yourself, right?
Do you think that Blackness in Mexico is a taboo subject? That's a comment that's coming up, and it is true that we don't recognize our racism within our Mexicanness, and it needs to be called out, and we need to be held accountable. But the question that Chandel has is, I wonder if Blackness in Mexico is another taboo subject.
Well, I would say this. I think Blackness in Mexico is probably a taboo subject in Mexico, but the idea of Blackness as Mexican, right, is also a taboo subject in the United States, right? So, that's one of the things I think that's important for us to recognize too, is that the implications here then, right, are that these same myths, right, that get reproduced over and over and over again to reproduce Mexicanidad, then are used across the U.S.-Mexico border, right, to position Mexican Americans or Chicanos, right, or Chicanx folks as not Black in a way that allows those communities to engage in a politics in the United States too. Right?
And that's where Blaxican comes in.
Well, yeah, right. So that's where then people will make this distinction as a way to talk about two separate things coming together to make one thing. But I think in Mexico, I don't know that Blackness is necessarily taboo because everybody talks about it.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. But it's not polite, right? And so then they talk about Blackness in a way that is instrumental. They use Blackness as a way to say other things, to make other claims, right? Yeah. To call somebody something, to tell you to stop acting a particular way, to tell you to change the way you might dress, to stop being so sexual, right? All of these other kinds of things, right?
That get loaded onto a particular subject over here.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So Johanna asks, how do you separate race? Oh no, I'm sorry. Yeah, how do you separate how race interacts in the Mexican state from how it interacts here in the U.S. in order to come in with a fresh perspective? And I think that's a fair question for folks in the U.S. who are thinking about Blackness outside of the U.S. Yeah. How do you let go of what you think you know and learn and hear?
So I think one of the things then is that we have to train ourselves to think beyond form, right? And we have to ask ourselves, how is it that what we see might function, right, in a way that does something else, right? So a lot of folks are looking for racism in Mexico in the same way that they might look for racism in the United States, right? And so they say, well, look, if the form doesn't exist in Mexico in the same way that it does in the United States, then we don't have it, right? The question might be is to ask yourself, how do these relationships function, right, to do the same thing in Mexico that they do in the United States, or that they do in Brazil, or that they do in Colombia, or that they do in other places in the quote unquote Americas, right? So thinking about the function of racism, right, and how that function then is specific to particular places, right, rather than focusing on the form and saying, because I can't see it in its form, it doesn't exist.
So another question is, where did this movement of inclusivity, regional inclusivity, start, and why was it allowed to gain traction or space?
Right. That's a tough one, right? So I think first we have to remember, right, that these things happen in negotiation, right? Everything, right, in our world is it's a product of a social, right, a relationship. So, you know, beyond simply going into communities with extreme violence and saying, hey, you will no longer talk about this subject. Yeah. I don't know that the government could have allowed, right,
the conversation to evolve.
Right. But I think what happened is in the 90s, right, there were folks in the Costa Chica who started to interact with other people, right, outside of the Costa Chica, outside of Mexico, right. There were Black folks that started to come to the Costa Chica. And there were these conversations, right, that were being had. And so then I think Black folks in different communities started to ask themselves how they might fit into some of those conversations. There was this priest from Trinidad who came to stay in Mexico and do some work in Mexico. And, you know, he really started to engage with folks, right, around issues of poverty, around issues of resources and these kinds of things. And a conversation developed there, right? And then these other popping up that were having conversations similarly, but in other ways, right? And so there's still a bunch of different organizations in Mexico that are talking about Blackness, but they're talking about it in similar, right? Yeah, different ways, I think, for different, perhaps, agendas. But they then are pushing that conversation, I think, forward now, right? But really, I think to recognize that those conversations happen in negotiation, right? So practically then, those conversations have to unfold in a particular way that brings the Mexican government to the table. I saw that someone had a question about Haitian immigrants.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, and actually we were kind of talking about that while you were off. So the question is whether or not the presence of Haitian immigrants, it might be changing some of that narrative. And I do note that the presence of Haitian immigrants is very much a border phenomena. So I wasn't really sure that it has the same impact in other parts of Mexico that it does perhaps on the border.
Right. Yeah, I don't think that it does, but I think one of the questions I think is how is it that Haitians in Mexico, or the understandings of Haitian in Mexico actually support, right, what it is that Mexicans already think they know about Blackness. And I guess what I mean to say is how is it then that the existence of Haitians in Mexico as immigrants and all of these other things that might be associated with Haitian immigrants ultimately then reproduces, right, the historical understanding of Blackness in Mexico. Is Blackness as different? Is Blackness as exotic? Is Blackness as all of these other kinds of things, right?
Yeah, and so one of the things that kind of goes with that is Dr. Bartel notes that she appreciates the conversation around the distinction between the function of racism and its form, the distinctions and the similarities. So what are the risks of reading racism in its form instead of its function as it relates to a certain American exceptionalism? How do anti-racist struggles and anti-colonial struggles connect in this conversation in Mexico?
Right. For me, I think to answer that question is to really try to, at least I'm trying to think about that question. And for me, it's really about trying to understand what role Blackness continues to play, right? Not only in Mexico, right, but in the modern nation, right, or in the world that we live in, right? And how is it that Blackness then is seized upon to do other things, right, to do other work? And so asking then not necessarily simply asking for Mexico, for example, what role does Blackness play in Mexico? Or better, how is Blackness put to work in Mexico, right? Then allows us to see a particular form of racism or discrimination or Black value, right? Mm-hmm. Put to work in Mexico to do other things. And I think for me then, that question of what it is that Blackness continues to be used for, how is Blackness put to work, right? Both by Black folks and non-Black folks, right? I think.
But that's part of your whole conversation on mestizaje, right? The mestizaje was literally created without Blackness being an equal partner in that conversation alongside indigeneity and European ancestry.
Absolutely, or Blackness as sort of the dark matter or the ghost, right? Mm-hmm. was sort of a baseline, right, to be able to produce those other kinds of things, right? Which is Black.
Very different from the U.S., right?
Yeah, I think so. People would say, for example, that it's definitely different than Brazil, right? Or it's different than some of those other nations where the idea of mestizaje or the mixture, right? Blackness was incorporated into that from the beginning, right? But I don't know that Blackness was incorporated functionally in a different way, right? So I think that's, for me, the key, right? So while Blackness was not necessarily incorporated into the paradigm of mestizaje in Mexico, and it was in Brazil, I wonder if Blackness still functions in the same way, right? To produce, right, those nation states, one directly and the other one indirectly, right?
So Max asked how mainstream media in Mexico affects the Afro and the Black community in Mexico. And I think in particular, and Max, correct me if I'm wrong, feel free to type in there, that you're asking about the forms of identity. Yes. Okay.
So maybe clarify just a little bit. How is it that I don't know that I understand the question.
Max, you want to clarify? How has mainstream media in Mexico affected the Afro-Black community in Mexico? And in particular in the way in which identities are being lived, experienced, and perhaps constructed.
Right. Well, I guess I would maybe ask all of us to think about how it is that we see Blackness, or how have we historically seen Blackness represented in Mexico through the media, right? And so first of all, then Blackness is oftentimes not represented as local, right? It's always represented as foreign. And then when it is represented as local, it's represented historically, right? Now there's two examples we could use. Both of them, I guess anecdotal is not the right word, but in things that I've seen in my own experience. So the under 20 World Cup, I think it was the under 20 World Cup, and I think 2006 or 2007, the Mexican national team was playing an African team. I want to say it was from the Republic of Congo or something at the time. And the way that the Mexican media, right, the Oaxacan media at the time, the way that they really sort of played up the tension, right, was that they made this a match between Mexico, right, and these civilized Mexico, right, and uncivilized Africa, right, and this was the chance, right, for Mexico to really show its place, right, in the civilized world.
Was and this so what they did? Summer?
Yeah.
So this is the summer that we were there.
and so what they and so what they did then is they had these and I can't what's his name too? What was the young star? He's half Brazilian. His brother played on the national team too, but they were on the under 20 team, or his brother was, and then they played on the older adult national team. Yeah,
Santos.
That's right. And so
thanks, Bernie.
And so, they showed, right, the Mexican under 20 team firing these goals, right, and just running these laps to victory. And right after, the team would make this goal, they would then cut into pictures of the movie Congo, right? And so the Mexican team scores a goal, and then you have these gorillas jumping up and down, right? And these caves crashing down because now their world is falling apart, right? On top of these animals, right? On top of these gorillas, right? And that's just sort of one way in which Blackness gets represented in Mexico, right? Not a Black Mexican Blackness, right? But that's the way then that the idea of Blackness continues to live in Mexico. And that was in 2007, right? And there are other examples, right? The whole Marine Penguin, thing and those kinds of things. Another example, I think, is there's a popular, and these are all things that I write about, but there's a popular pan bimbo pastry, right? And now it's called nido, right? But it used to be called negrito, right? Yep. And so this negrito treat, right, is a sort of a vanilla cake, I guess, covered in chocolate or something like that. And the older images of the negrito were, what would be sort of the stereotypical African bushman, right? Mm-hmm. With these over-exaggerated features and whatnot, right? So Blackness in Mexico, or Blackness has been used, right, in Mexico to talk about in the same way it has been in other places, right? The uncivilized, the backwards, the animalistic, all of those things, right? And in some ways, right, that was relatively safe because people suggest there weren't any Black folks in Mexico, right? But now the question is, how do you deal with that, right, in the context of Black recognition in the present, right? And so I think for a while, what happens is you might have those two things living side by side. Not might, I think you do. Right?
Yeah. So I'm not seeing, oh wait. And Dr. Jerry posts his published work for those interested. I'll tell you what I will do is on the Center for Latin American Studies website and in the Center for Brazilian Studies websites, we will have a list of some of his publications that are dealing with the conversations that we're having right now. Absolutely. And thank you very much for wanting to read his work and take this conversation much further, because there's so much more there. we could talk about. Did we lose him again?
No, I'm here. Sorry.
Okay.
I'm
yes.
having all sorts of technical difficulties.
Yeah, that's okay. That's the story of our life right now. Yes, this webinar will be posted and it will be available long term. Let me just ask if anybody has any other questions before we ask Jerry to give us, Dr. Jerry to give us a kind of wrap up on all of this. Does anybody have any other burning questions that they would like? Oh wait, here's one. Okay, it is interesting how we can venerate the Mexican leaders and the accomplishments of Afro-mestizos while minimizing their ethnicity or their representation. Jose Maria Morelos, Vicente Guerrero, and the Afro-mestizo community who founded the great cities of San Diego and Los Angeles in California.
Right. But what is the actual question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, there's no question there. I think he's just giving us some insight. And then Dr. Bartel says, I'd like to revisit this question of Afro-Latinidad versus Blackness.
Sure. Give me 1 second.
What are the linkages and tensions? That's where we were going when we lost you last time.
Okay, 1 second.
Yep. That's not an avoidance, Dr. Bartel. He's going to hit on that question.
All right, I'm sorry about that. So I guess the question for me then is, how do you talk about a particular experience? Do you talk about that experience in a way that connects folks to other communities, right, throughout Latin America? Does it make sense to talk about that experience in that way? Or do we, depending upon the situation, do we need other ways, right, to be able to talk about that experience? So I think for me, I ask, what work does the idea of an Afro-Latinidad do, right? Does it force us to engage with the local? Does it force us to engage with the particular histories and the use of Blackness in particular spaces, right? Or does it allow us to leave certain things intact and then talk about a shared cultural presence, right? Or a shared cultural experience that supposedly then connects communities to communities to communities to communities in different places in Latin America. So I wonder then, for me, I think this is one of the important reasons to think about, not the Black Pacific, right? Because I don't know that exactly exists, but Blackness in the Pacific, right? Okay. Because these communities then, there's nothing necessarily that connects Colombia to Mexico, right? Beyond, right, the idea of them being African descendants, right? If you talk about a place that's been theorized as sort of the Black Atlantic, right, mm-hmm. You might then be able to talk about these sort of connections, right, that have historically, right, continued to exist from place to place to place to place, or that were sort of a part of these different routes, right, of Black folks that ultimately then became rooted, right, in a particular cultural context. I don't know if that's the case in a place like Mexico, right? You may say that that's possible in a place like Veracruz, for example, right? But on the Costa Chica, I think it asks us to think about something different. And I think for me then, the idea of Blackness then is a way to talk about a type of discrimination. It's a way to talk about how it is that Blackness has been put to work in particular places as a way to produce something else, right? Something that Black folks haven't been able to use as their own, to maintain, and these other kinds of things, right? And that's just sort of some of the distinctions, right? I think other folks have their own sort of reasons for either, preferring the term Black or Blackness over an Afro-Latinidad. But my understanding is that Afro-Latinidad is in a lot of ways about a particular, a shared sort of cultural kind of, not just origin, but sort of contemporary culture as well, right?
So what about colorism? That's one of the questions that's coming up. What about colorism in Mexico? Because that's very real, right? Tu bebé es muy prieto, tu bebé es muy güerito.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the question, right? What about
what about colorism in Mexico? Yeah, it's there. It exists.
What about colorism in Mexico? Yeah, absolutely. It is there, but Yeah. But how do we, I think there's a distinction to be made, right? Because there's, you know, somebody might be born into a family and they're the darkest person in the family and they're called negro, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then people say, okay, but that's a type of discrimination or whatever, right? My concern then is how do we talk about not simply the levels of color that allow us to talk about discrimination, but how do we link that color specifically to an understanding of a particular person as African descendant, right? As not just dark in skin color, right? But Black for, you know, all of these other different reasons, right? Colorism definitely exists. And I think it's associated with racial discrimination in Mexico. But I think colorism then is also another sort of model to talk about discrimination that exists outside, right, of the experience of racial Blackness or racialized Blackness or African descendants, right?
Yeah. But the association is there.
The association is there in a way, but yeah. I don't know that they're the same, and I think
yeah.
like I think we need different paradigms to talk about different things, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if you could just talk to us a little bit about where your research is going.
Yeah. So my research now is really I'm really interested in the possibilities for Black folks in the United States, at least in the U.S. Southwest, to talk about their struggles in the context of citizenship. And I guess what I really mean to say is, how is it that I'm interested to think about Black and Mexican relations, I think, in the U.S.-Mexico border. And one of the questions I have is, why is it that some groups in the U.S.-Mexico border can talk about issues of immigration, they can talk about education, they can talk about healthcare, they can talk about these things as associated with their citizenship, right? As if their legal citizenship status will fix all of those things, right? And if that is the case, right, then how come that hasn't been the case for Black folks, right? And so one of the what I'm really interested in is, how is it that different groups have access, right, to claims to citizenship, and then can use the idea of citizenship, right, as a way to make claims on others, as a way to motivate others, I guess, to action, right, or a way to, you know, tap into resources and those kinds of things. And for me, then, it is in some ways a continuation of the work that I'm doing in Mexico. But it's asked me to then think about how it is that Blackness in Blackness in the Southwest is used as a way to talk about a racial or a difference, right, between Blacks and Mexicans in the United States, right? So you brought up Blaxican, or the idea of Blaxican, before. And so in the United States, that makes perfect sense, right? Because Black and Mexican are mutually exclusive, right? And in the myth in Mexico, they're mutually exclusive too, but the conversation is changing in Mexico. And so I'm interested then in what the impact of that conversation will be on the politics between Black and Mexican folks in the United States. I think that's a better.
But I'm intrigued with the way in which you just said that. So because Black and Mexican are discrete entities in the US. So as a Black Mexican who finds themselves in the US, I have to create a new identity. I have to understand myself very differently.
Right, outside of the idea of Mexican or Mexico. Absolutely. Absolutely. And so what that does then is it forces Black folks who come from Mexico to the United States, at least in the Southwest, right? It may be a bit different in a place like North Carolina, or places in the
I don't think so.
in the Northeast, I'm sorry, the Southeast. But at least in what I found in the Southwest is that Black folks who come from Mexico to the United States are making allegiances, right? Not necessarily with Black communities in the United States, but other Black Latin Americans, right? Other Afro-Latinos in the United States, because they've been excluded from what it means to be, right, Mexican in the United States. And so that then asked them to take on a different type of politics, right? But there is also this overlap where young folks, young Black Mexicans who have come to the Southwest start to talk about themselves in a way that is similar to the way that, Black folks in the United States talk about themselves. So I went to a wedding in Pasadena, and I caught these, young folks in the bathroom, and they were throwing around the N-word, right? And some people would say, hey, that's just pop culture. A lot of people use the N-word, right? But my question is, but how is it that these folks are pushed to make sense of the N-word, right, in a racial context, rather than just simply in a popular form, right? And so I think, how's that?
I said, and is there a difference, really?
Well, I think maybe if you see a group of folks on the basketball court, throwing the word around, right, they might be tapping into some pop culture, right? But other folks have to wear that word or use that word because it fits in another way.
Yeah, okay.
And so what I'm really interested sort of broadly is how it is that developments in Mexico then are impacting or will eventually impact relations between what we see as two distinct groups in the United States, right? Black and Latinos, specifically Black Americans and Mexican Americans. And how it is then that though both of those groups are positioned in different ways in the context of citizenship.
Fabulous. Thank you.
If that makes any sense at all.
Well, it makes enough sense to know that I look forward to the next set of pieces that come from you. And Chandel says it does. It makes sense.
Okay, all right. Yeah.
So, Dr. Jerry, I want to thank you. It is always nice to have you back home. I also want to promote the fact that Dr. Jerry, we are roping him into running an ethnographic field school for us as soon as we can travel again down into the Costa Chica. So for those of you that are looking for an amazing mentor, an amazing opportunity, hopefully 2021 will bring that to us. Dr. Jerry, any final things you want us to think about before we let you go?
I don't know. I think I'll have to leave.
Chandel wants to know if there are any other books you might recommend that folks pick up and read, anything that has influenced you.
You know what, there's a lot of theoretical stuff that I'm trying to get through on citizenship. As far as the ethnographic work goes, I think if you were to just do a search on Black Mexico or Blackness in Mexico, I think a lot of stuff comes up that I would recommend. But I'm still trying to answer that question there. Any books that I would recommend, right? So yeah, I can't say right off the bat, no. Okay. Thank you.
Dr. Rios.
Thank you, Bernardo.
So Dr. Rios is part of our network over here. So his comments there under the chat, for those of you that don't know, he's part of us. So thank you very much. I want to thank everybody who participated with us today. And Dr. Jerry's contact information is super easy to find, but you can always contact us in the Center for Latin American Studies for other ways to make contact. So thank you very much. Dr. Jerry, thank you so very much.
My pleasure. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties.
It happens. It happens. It's the story of our lives right now.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Say hi to the family.
I will do.
Okay.